At the very end of Modes of Thought, Whitehead writes, philosophy is akin to poetry. In each case, there is reference to form beyond the direct meaning of words. Poetry allies itself to meter, philosophy to mathematic pattern. In my talk today, I would like to propose an intersection of artistic performance and process philosophy in the practice of reading poetry. I will explain why I think process thought and poetry might be a useful pairing. First, poetry, like music, is an intricately articulated art of sounding. Both arts compose with more or less clearly articulated and coordinated events, or equivalently, as I shall say, durations or endurance, relatively brief or long moments or spans where such quantitative difference is itself an essential factor in composition. Here, an event or duration will be understood as an analytic abstraction from the complex, emerging, and enduring social order that is reading. The fluid composition of events, their successions, their overlappings, and subsumptions, is what I shall call rhythm. Here, rhythm will not imply periodicity. Rather, like the early Greek rhythmos, before Plato introduced into it the concept of number, it names the particular way an event forms or takes shape. Second, process philosophy comes into the picture as a way of thinking about rhythm and about things like event, succession, and duration. I believe that thinking about these things as a way of thinking about the workings of art could be valuable for artists and scholars of art seeking new ways of understanding and teaching. For philosophy, I would suggest that these two arts might provide laboratories for experimenting with categories that define process thought. Here, I will concentrate on poetry, but note that poetry's sister art, music, is always involved. When poets speak of the music of poetry, they are not speaking metaphorically. Poetry has a music of its own, a music that is part of poetry's intense eventfulness, an eventfulness that is poetry's very meaning. Indeed, poiesis means making, creating. Poetry's eventfulness crucially depends on its bodily, sonic, and kinesthetic rhythm, even when said and read internally. And remember that we can't but hear when we read internally. So silent reading is not really silent. And it is to this action of reading that I shall turn. Reading as a verb. I will not entirely ignore the other reading, the noun, reading as something that can be discussed and written about. After all, I'm here discussing something that I've written about. Nonetheless, I shall concentrate on the verb, for I believe that it is primary. It is also highly problematic in the best sense of the word, the sense of raising questions and asking to take thinking forward into new adventures of thinking. But not to let the noun have the only say. I will take a chance here and do some actual reading with you. I suggest a sort of empirical experimentation, a testing or trying out reading carried out by an individual reader. This is quite different from the approaches of experimental psychology, which aim for pure objectivity, and different too from classical phenomenology, which aims for a sort of transcendental subjectivity. Rather, in the spirit of James's radical empiricism and Deleuze's transcendental empiricism, I envision a method that moves back and forth between the inviolable subjectivity of actual occasions of reading and the objectification of those readings in a rhythm of thinking with and thinking about, inside and outside, working together to create new experiences and new perspectives. This would be a process of learning both with and from, something like Whitehead's image of education as an alternating takeoffs and landings. I mention education here to bring the topic of poetry down to earth. For whatever else poetry is, It is, like all art forms, a craft. Writing and reading take skill and practice, and their teachings involve what I shall call craft discourses. For example, in music, harmony and counterpoint, in painting, perspective and color theory, in literature, rhetoric, and prosody. Such discourses survive only if they continue to serve practice, and they always draw, however obliquely, on reigning philosophical concepts. There is reason to believe that our current moment, new concepts are needed. I would point to the extraordinary interest artists, and especially visual artists, have taken in Deleuze's ideas in the past 2 or 3 decades. For whatever reason, I suspect institutional, music and poetry have not much participated. And yet, in my reading of recent literary criticism, I've encountered repeatedly and from different quarters a dissatisfaction with current theories of prosody and a desire for new methods, along with a pessimism that such renewal might not be forthcoming. Here, I would suggest that method may be a place where art and philosophy can meet. As art seeks tests of knowledge, and philosophy seeks tests of experience. Think of methodos as a result of knowledge where hodos, or way, is active in search of adventure. This perspective is in sharp contrast with method's modern meaning, that of a procedure, routine, methodical, rule-bound. Process philosophy seems like a good fit for the old methodos as a way of thinking that might question reductions of procedure and rule, and a way of thinking that might contribute to new practices that include art and art's knowledge. This method of experimentation, like all scientific methods, rests on repetition, carefully and critically observed, close readings, and it would call for a new and fully temporalized understanding of prosody. Prosody is generally understood as the study or doctrine of formal poetic articulation, naming constituent units and the allowable patterns that they can form for particular genres of poetry in various literary traditions, ancient and modern. Prosody is often defined as the study of meter, rhythm, and intonation broadly construed. Prosody can offer rules of proper construction and recitation. It characteristically involves punctuation and can describe larger units such as paragraph or stanza. European languages continue to use the vocabulary of the ancient Greek prosoidia, as that vocabulary was adapted to the very different language of Latin. Because we have no recorded sound, it remains unclear how these poetries were recited. Current prosody retains the ancient names of the combinations of syllables, the so-called feet, iambs, dactyls, etc. Though surely these categories were far more meaningful when they were fresh. Since the 1970s, there's been attempts to give prosody scientific standing by aligning it with structuralist linguistics, Cartesian linguistics, I think. Much of this work has been centered on the rules of acceptable iambic pentameter lines tested against a poetic corpus. Milton's Paradise Lost has been a favorite source. In Western traditions, identification of units and their lawful combinations has dominated as a description of practice. Missing from these traditions are temporal and performative perspectives that would admit variation and nuance that emerge in actual saying. Such perspectives are incompatible with unit and rule-based models. Incidentally, I should say that ancient literary discipline of rhetoric, public speaking, whether improvised or written, has been somewhat more open to process in its pragmatic goal of influencing listeners through engaging, passionate argument delivered in public, always in a definite here and now situation. In my approach to poetic performance, events as decisions in saying will substitute for units or items, and text will be taken as opportunities for saying. Rules for saying will be seen as rules of thumb, not as ultimate regularities. To more directly confront these issues, I've chosen an example of free verse because this genre is especially resistant to the reduction of unit and rule. Although it has been for 100 years the dominant practice of high art English verse, free verse has consistently quite eluded theories of prosody. It seems that prosody was not designed to deal with such openness. I've chosen Ezra Pound's 1913 poem, The Return, and I provided you with a handout rather than projecting it on the screen. I think you'll find it easier to read this way, and some of you may wish to read it again later. This is an early and influential English free verse poem, praised for its rhythm or musicality. W.B. Yeats called it the most beautiful poem that has been written in the free form, one of the few in which I find real organic rhythm. Yeats clearly heard something remarkable in its 20 verses and 5 stanzas, in spite of his resistance to this new practice. Free verse, from its inception, has been problematical. Its proponents celebrated a new rhythmic energy that could be felt, but not clearly explained, and thus difficult to rationally justify in its rejection of the regularities of traditional verse. It was an offense against versification, and indeed an offense against prosody as an explanation of the regularities of verse. Moreover, since it obeyed no external rule, readers were unsure exactly how to read it or how it was meant to be said. By contrast, traditional, or so-called bound verse, presented a set number of syllables and or beats per line, so that regardless of the challenges of saying, the structure of the verse was clear and provided an agreed-upon framework for saying. In free verse, the number of syllables and beats from verse to verse or line to line is variable. Prosody has remained at a loss for how to explain such changeable rhythm. But before we enter into this poem's rhythm, I should provide you with some background. Pound gave the name Imagism to this new movement which grew out of French symbolism. In reaction to the prolix narrativity of 19th century English Romantic poetry, Imagism sought with great concision to explore momentary configurations of feeling, concrete or imagined, and to do this in nuanced and fluid rhythm. Pound changed the name, feeling that some of his fellow imagists, led by Amy Lowell, were falling away from his goal, Pound changed the name to Vorticism. Indeed, the dynamicism implied by the new name better fitted the modernist aesthetic that around 1913 was coming to be dominated by high energy, speed, compression, and fracture. Cubism in painting and the new free tonality, freie Tonalität in music. Poetry's characteristic intensification and probabilization of speech is here pushed to a new extreme. I'll let you take a couple of minutes to read the poem without my intervention, except to urge you not to rush. Take your time and above all, listen, even as you read silently. A bit later, I'll read the poem out loud. And don't worry too much about the so-called meaning. Just enter into the world of this art object. Okay? I don't interrupt, but I don't know what we're planning to do. Okay, we'll come back to this. I'll explain my annotations in more detail shortly. Suffice it for now to say that they are quite unfoot-like. Each mark labels a syllable as an elementary event, rather like the note event in written music. But unlike musical notation, there is no attempt to represent durations of syllables or the beats they form. Determining the durations of these brief events is one of the pleasures and challenges of reading. And determining their durations will involve many factors working together in the composition of larger events such as phrase, sentence, and stanza. In a processive world, these different scales would work together. Scalar differences in duration are both quantitative and qualitative. Various quantitative levels or orders of duration are also qualitatively different. How long? In what way long? Different spans of duration differ in complexity and recruit different spans of kinds of memory, long-term, short-term, working, episodic, however this may be. Here, sequential things are vectoral. They follow from. Things follow and grow out of one another, not against one another as objects juxtaposed. Here, the compounding of things is composing, not containing or being contained. In compounding, things grow together, compress in a variable and constantly changing situation. A general word for this process is syntax, putting together. Here, a composition is not to be understood as a completed work, but as an activity. It is made in reading and writing, only in reading and writing. Think of syntax as process, not arrangement. As we shall see, there can be no absolute distinction of syntax and semantics, nor for that matter of syntax and phonology. By the way, recent work by Boris Gasparov creates a linguistics that would be constant with these ideas. These so-called levels of linguistic analysis can raise interesting questions from a temporal processive perspective, questions quite alien to structural linguistics. The defining event of written poetry is the poetic line or verse, defining in the sense that verse is a synonym for poetry. From versus, a turn of the plow, verses or turns are indicated through punctuation. In modern verse, lines. Verse thus refers to written poetry. But whether written or not, poetry comes in wave after wave of such events, which are carefully composed and, if you like, regulated. They are normally relatively closed syntactically as phrases or sentences, though as we shall see, this norm of closure is often broken in creative ways, by elision or enjambment, for example. In the case of bound verse, verses can be heard as repetitions with difference, repetitions of a given number of syllables and or beats per line. But this repetition is never exact. No repetition is exact. In each new verse, new patterns are to be discovered, and each new verse is significantly different in meaning and feeling from its predecessors. The new event constructs its own novelty through its complex contrasts with and repetitions of its relevant predecessors, the most relevant invariably being its immediate predecessor. Indeed, a non sequitur can be powerfully disruptive. Poetry's specially crafted sort of eventfulness shares the eventfulness of language in general, where in continuous speech, sentence follows sentence in less carefully articulated and generally faster streams. But more to the point, quite unlike the rhythm of open, unbounded speech, poetry is made to be said again and again as a source of intense mindful experience and learning, often across generations. This pausing and repeating is a cognitive discipline or ritual that slows and deepens thinking. It is also, and necessarily, a reflection on language itself. We might say that poetry is language turning on itself. Language turning on itself here is a poetic expression, a pun, a play on words. Perhaps philosophy is also a kind of play on words, revealing, as Whitehead says, something beyond their direct meanings. Reading the return repeatedly and with care will involve negotiating events at varying scales of syntax, emerging in varying degrees of focus. And in each reading, that will be a new composition. Exploring these possibilities of composition is the creative discipline of reading. To take a brief flight over this poem before touching ground in an out loud reading, I would like to set out with the briefest constituent events shown in my annotation. Syllables and the composition of larger events that we could informally call consecutive or non-isochronous beats. In my annotation, vertical lines label initiations or beginnings of events. The slanted lines continue the event already begun. The vertical line is not durationless. Indeed, it is a poor representation of an event's emergence, which always takes time. Here, beginning is not separate from the event in its entirety. The line marks a growing duration that continues growing until the event ends. The event, when past and no longer going on, will now have a definite duration, something that can be taken into account by a following event, and most especially by its immediate predecessor, at whatever level that predecessor might be. The mark of initiation is a process or event category that might replace the traditional static categories of accent and strong beat. Continuations are small events that do not end the present event. There are two types of continuation. One, marked by the backward slanting line, remains in the thrall of beginning, passively playing out the duration promised by beginning. The other, a forward slanting line, marks a continuation that, while still playing out the event's duration, becomes unmoored, pointing toward a successor. Such an anticipatory continuation, if it emerges, generally emerges late and intensifies as the time for the present event is running out. Its anticipatory character carries to one degree or another an intensification of feeling. In some circumstances, this function can form in the absence of a prior beginning. In such cases, we must say that the function will have formed once there is now a new beginning. This also shows the unit-like character of the event. The durations of these small composite events are flexible and very keenly felt. Such durational quantity need not be at all comparable to the exactitude of a clock, especially in complex situations such as poetry presents, and were not said too fast. Speed, in any case, is a crucial and formative factor in event formation of any kind. The three functions shown on your handout are rarely disputable if syllables are said slowly, and that's quite remarkable. People, once they know how to use these things, agree almost always, and when they don't agree, it's an interesting question. They are determined by all the factors that can come into play, but principally by the factor we call syntax. Indeed, this level of duration with these marks might be called microsyntactical. I've gone into considerable detail discussing this level of duration, but not nearly as much as it demands. Before turning very briefly to other more complex levels of interaction and the interaction of levels, I will read the opening stanza event slowly to illustrate. Please forgive my untrained out loud reading voice. By the way, public reading is a very special kind of reading, which I have had very little experience with. The return. See, they return. Ah, See the tentative movements and the slow feet, the trouble in the pace and the uncertain wavering. I didn't really like that. Just the beginning of it, because it's a see, they return. See the tentative movements and the slow feet. You know, I memorize. I wouldn't write about it or memorize. And it's interesting. I found it much easier to say more satisfactorily when I wasn't reading it. So that's another thing to remember about poetry. It really is meant to be read in that kind of way that writing allows us to enter into memory. Anyway. In reading this passage, notice how very many decisions must be made and how very many factors must be involved. However, the naming of factors and their systematic relations is open to question. This would be developing a new prosody, a new theory of literary composition. There is much room here for new thinking, a lot of room for new thinking. I will point out a few of the various factors that have come into play in my reading. In this stanza, notice that there are two sentence events. Yeah, that's not clear. The first one is see the return. That's a sentence, even though it's a semicolon. The first is short and forceful, beginning with a command, the imperative, see. Someone says this to another, us perhaps, directing our attention to a nameless they. Then, after a semicolon, not a period, the wordless syllable, as the speaker and hearer take in the scene. How long to wait before our guide tells us what to see? We wait until the time seems right, just right. The new and, as it will turn out, large and complex sentence event, did it begin with or with the second anticipatory see? In any case, we are being told to see four things that they are doing, not in chronological order, but in a special poetic order, with a traditional name, chiasmus, a reversal midway, A, B, B, A, symmetrical, weirdly defying temporal situation. In the middle, the first, tentative movements, is matched by the fourth, uncertain wavering. Wavering is a special sort of movement. In the middle, the trouble in the pace is matched by the slow feet. Slow feet is a so-called spondaic foot, and the only clear spondee in the poem. A spondee is indeed a slow foot. The tongue-in-cheek pun here lets us know, had we not already guessed, that this is lyric poetry, not a miniature romantic epic about ancient hunters, forgotten gods, or whatever. There are two corresponding enjambments, the only enjambments or crossing of lines in verse in the poem. The corresponding tentative movements and the uncertain wavering. These will take considerable care and thought and practice in saying. By the way, Milton is the master of enjambment and chiasmus. Indeed, for all his purported iambic pentameter regularity, Milton is no less challenging to read than is the modernist Pound. In yet another dimension, a knowledgeable reader or listener might well come to picture the narrator here as a Virgil, explaining to an attentive Dante what dismal scene lies before them. Is the reader of this poem a speaker or a hearer? All these forces and literally countless others can shape our micro-timings in extraordinarily precise ways. Whitehead suggests that while vision is limited to 3 dimensions, the audible world also voluminous, has many more. He tongue-in-cheek suggests 15 dimensions, by the way. Before reading the poem and summing up, I would like to take a high altitude and supersonic flight across the course of this poem's 5 stanzas. Each stanza has its own character and rhythm. The end of the second stanza is a sudden and dramatic shift from they to those, from present to past tense. From they to these, I said those, they to these. These were. And to a weirdly archaic language. The beginning of the stanza in its second line throws us into a puzzling world as if we fell through some kind of metaphorical crack into the phantasmic world. If the first stanza is syntactically the most complex, the second is most complex semantically, with its peculiar metaphor of fear as half awakened. What does that mean? And hesitating snow. There's a lot going on here, a lot to think about, to slow down and repeat and try out and discover. By the way, many of you have probably seen a particular kind of hesitation before in a snowstorm, when a new gust of wind changes direction and you can, for the briefest moment, see discrete snowflakes before they turn into lines of snow. This is, by the way, a remarkable question of temporality and subjectivity in this image. And then out of nowhere, these were the winged with awe, inviolable. Winged with awe in quotation marks. A non sequitur that closes the stanza event and breaks open a new mythical or pretend mythical world where the pace quickens quite dramatically. Things really pick up now. Each stanza makes its own rules. And now we are on a roll, up until the last stanza, when suddenly it brings us crashing back to earth in the traditional form of a concluding couplet. In the implied present tense we started with, but now with so much more specificity. Now we can see the hounds, the silver hounds, the animal nature they have brought with them, their sense of sound in hearing, hi, hi, their sense of smell, the blood of their living bodies. Notice the contrast with the murmuring snow of the second stanza event. The senses and the body on display, but now sadly slow and pallid. Incidentally, it is possible to view, in view of everything that has happened, to make one last and archaic spondee. Rather than saying leash men, which should be English, leash men, as if this were an old English compound on the pattern of keen scenting in line 17. And yes, men, not gods. It's up to you to decide, and the decision will be and have an effect. I'll now read the poem a bit faster. Okay, and I'm too worried about doing this from memory, so I feel like a pianist. Try, okay. See, they return. Ah, see the tentative movements and the slow refuge, the trouble in the pace and the uncertain wavering. See, they return, one and by one, with fear as half awakened, as if the snow should hesitate and murmur in the wind and half turn back. These were the winged with awe in violet. Gods of the winged shoe, with them the silver hound, sniffing the trace of air. Hi, hi! These were the swift to harry, these the keen scented, these were the souls of blood, slow on the leash, pallid the leash men. So, there's no end of things we could say about reading this poem, and no end of directions in which our thought about saying might take us. We might, for example, take the exercise as an opportunity to explore the variety of factors that can come into play in saying, and ask how they systematically interact in the production of events at various durational levels or scales. Incidentally, one of the dimensions I have not mentioned, among many, is mouth shape and the patterns that emerge from movements of the lips and tongue. For example, hear and feel the movement in see, they return, ah. A movement from the very front to the very back, from high to low frequency or intensity. And also listen to the repetition. See, they return, ah. See the tentative movements. By the way, the tentative is great. It's tentative. It's such an amazing word, tentative. And also tenere, holding, tentative. So to say that, can be an amazing experience, to try to think of the holding and the insecurity of tentative, and then the enjambment tentative movements. To make that break means that sudden shift, tentative movements. So you can hear the new line without hiding supports. Anyway. Please do not imagine that such detail is trivial or inessential. In poetry, such patterns of movement are integral, and to much poetry crucial. By the way, the theme or subject of this poem, like many other poems, is poetry itself, or a poesis, a way of inventing with language, taking language beyond itself, turning on language to keep language itself alive. Or, the exercise in reading might lead us into challenging questions of event or duration levels, of focus or changes of focus. Any of these so-called technical questions could be widened and deepened by turning to other poems and other genres or traditions or languages, and perhaps even to other modes of art making, to music, and also, obviously, to other questions of process in general. It remains an open question of how to proceed, but I would suggest two informal criteria for the success of an open method of discovery through close reading. The first is Whitehead's criterion of self-evidence. Yes, I've tried that out, and I see what you mean. I can feel something like that. I give my that. Or, as Whitehead suggests, failing such direct reference, a plausible, non-coercive argument, he calls it proof, might lead to provisional assent. Yes, I'm willing to go along with that and see where it leads. If the first criterion is self-evidence, the second criterion would be productivity, that observations lead beyond themselves to future thinking. The second criterion is really not detached from the first. In closing, I'd like to return to our beginning quotation for modes of thought. Philosophy is akin to poetry. In each case, there is a reference to form beyond the direct meaning of words. Poetry allies itself to meter, philosophy to mathematic pattern. With this careful expression, allies itself to, Whitehead avoids a sharp categorical distinction. By contrast, in What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari write that philosophy constructs with concepts, and art constructs with sensation. Science, they say, constructs with propositions. All are modes of thought. But how discrete are these modes, in fact? How many dimensions might there be in the vision, hearing, feeling of properly poetic ways of thought, or for that matter, philosophic ways of thought. As human cultural constructions, these activities are not distinguished as natural kinds, but proliferate in an indefinite and potentially endless modalities. Didier Delbez speaks of a universal mannerism, types, genres, changing traditions of thinking and feeling. The division of art and philosophy is not groundless, but division is always on the move and always problematic. As far as categorical distinction is concerned, Whitehead's warning, "nothing too much," seems wise counsel. Thank you.